Hello, welcome to my podcast. I'm your host, Larry Liu, and today I'm joined by Chris Maggio. He's currently a doctoral candidate in sociology at the Graduate Center, City University of New York, and he's going to be a postdoctoral fellow at the London School of Economics. His interests include race, ethnicity, migration, quantitative methods, political sociology, education, gender, and sexuality. His dissertation examines how recent demographic changes in the US related to race and immigration impact American social and political attitudes. So, Chris, thank you very much for being on.
Thanks for having me, Larry. Appreciate it.
Yeah, so let's talk very briefly about perhaps your upbringing. I mean, did you grow up in Maryland, right? If I remember correctly.
Yeah, I'm from the Baltimore area. I grew up in a town called Catonsville. It's in suburban Baltimore. Yeah, so I haven't lived there for quite a long time, but yeah, that's where I sort of grew up. Yeah.
And was there any, salient experiences where, that sort of led you into the route of sociology? I mean, into research and academic life?
If I had to go back, that far in time, I would probably point to I became interested in economics and particularly development economics, probably when I was in high school. I was reading, Jeffrey Sachs and Bill Easterly probably at that time, and I remember taking my first economics class in high school and really enjoying it and feeling like it was something that I was interested in and good at, and that's what I majored in college, and then it's sort of a winding path to sociology from there, I guess. But that was how I got interested in social science, I think, and kind of took me down that path.
So those names, Easterlin, so it's developmental economics. So it's the
Yeah,
idea of how do you take what the rich countries have done and apply this
yeah,
to poor countries?
yeah. Basically, I mean, these two at that time were sort of on two sides of this. I mean, I guess they still are in some ways on two sides of this debate about like how much of it is like sort of can be foreign aid driven, right, economic growth, and how much of it is more bottom up and institutions and entrepreneurship and stuff like that. So they were sort of like two big figures in that debate. um but I guess like if I'm making a sort of leap from there, it would be like, development economists mostly agreed about sort of the positive development impacts, economic growth in part, but just sort of the big gains to be made in terms of standard of living and wages and things like that through migration, right? And I guess that's, you could say that's how I got interested in migration, and then that kind of eventually led me to sociology, which I kind of perceive to be, a really good place to study migration. And then, of course, the people I've gotten to meet and work with, both faculty and students at CUNY are, really have driven that interest and help cultivate that as well.
Yeah. So, if somebody mentions the word development economics, I wouldn't get to the point of migration as a first thought. I mean, I would usually associate
Yeah.
it with usually some kind of like infant industry, building up, making sure the intellectual property rights work out fine, making sure that the government is actively supporting domestic industries. But and obviously, like from your venue, I mean, you don't necessarily deny that these are uh, valid paths of development. But would you say that migration is just the easier thing to do?
I think the best way to describe it is I think it's all part of like the same process in some ways, right? So the best way, so like one way to just to think about it is like, most people think about migration as this thing that happens from lower income countries to higher income countries, right? And there's certainly some truth to that, but the kind of empirical reality is that as countries increase their level of GDP from a low level to say a middle level, their immigration actually tends to increase, right? And so what are the reasons for this? So there's a bunch of potential reasons, but one is just that, migrating across borders is sort of expensive, and people at the sort of lowest level of incomes will often have a hard time doing that. Those people will often be more likely to migrate internally, actually. So from the rural areas to the bigger cities, and obviously, in a place that's the process of urbanization is a big, part of the contemporary story of migration. Um, you know, in places like China, where the movement of people from rural to urban areas is one of the biggest human movements in the history of the world, right? But you know as I said, economic growth kind of leads to this circumstance where people might have more resources to migrate. People might make that sort of two-way migration, two-step migration from an urban area first to an urban area. Then they become kind of more connected with international companies, or exposed to more sort of information about traveling abroad, and that can be influential. Another thing is like the increases in inequality, right? So if sort of you see that people in the place that you live, because of this economic growth, are all of a sudden having higher incomes, there's going to be this sort of raised expectations for consumption and things like that. um there's also sort of like the disruptions that happen during uh, a process of economic growth, where maybe like the agricultural jobs, become mechanized, and there's fewer of those. So people migrate again, might be first to the urban areas and then second abroad. Yeah, and so there's a bunch of reasons for this, but if you just think about, well, okay, so then we see like development might lead to migration. How can migration also positively impact development? The most obvious is just that if you think outside of just national borders, development is a process of people improving their living standards, right? So if someone leaves, it's not necessarily that the the national GDP is going to increase automatically, but that person's livelihood, sort of living standards could increase, and their personal earnings can increase. So that's a form of development in a sense, right? The other sort of ways it can happen, I think, the most obvious one is through remittances, right? So people travel abroad, they earn higher income than they could earn in the place that they're coming from. They send money back. It might not just be money though, too, right? It can be knowledge, skills, more opportunities for other people to migrate, lowering the barriers to that process, and that can contribute to development too. So I don't deny the things you say about, yes, when you think of development, you're certainly not only thinking of migration, you're thinking of industrial processes and changes to the economy, and economic growth in terms of GDP. But I think a lot of people would argue like migration is sort of like part of that process in many ways, right?
Yeah, so remittances can definitely have a positive role to play, especially in less developed countries. Because again, the issue is that it takes time, effort, skill, and all these other things to build up industry successfully at home. Um, but then the flip side of remittances, which oftentimes has positive connotations, is this idea of brain drain, right? Which is that
Yeah.
you're basically losing the talented people, and then all you're left with is sort of like the low skilled at the bottom of the industrial value chain, and as a result of that, your country struggles to get out of foreign debt and low standard of living. Um, so i- so how would you frame this
The brain
issue
drain.
of
Yeah.
brain drain versus remittances?
Yeah. So I don't necessarily think that brain drain is something that we shouldn't be concerned about at all. And I think like countries sometimes will put forth policies to help mitigate the effects of brain drain. I can talk about that. But just from I actually talk to my students a bunch about this semester when we had our week on migration, and kind of a way to like flip the thinking about remittance, about brain drain a little bit. So like one way to think about it is, you know, if people are leaving a country after they, you know, gain some level of education, usually that is an indicator that whatever was going on in that local economy was not creating the type of jobs and job market to sustain that educated population, right? So that's one thing, right? People are, this isn't happening in a vacuum. People are not leaving, you know, for no sort of reason at all, right? So that's something to start with. The other, of course, is like remittances, like we said, right? Like, so if they're earning more money abroad, they potentially are putting a lot of money back into the economy, and that may sort of like outweigh the sort of brain drain issue. But again, they're also not just sending back money, they're sending back skills, they're learning knowledge. And I can send you some articles about this, but there's certainly evidence that, you know, the sort of productivity gains that, you know, might come from sort of the quote unquote brain drain going back into the country of origin economy can be very beneficial as well. The other things to think about are, you know, I think often this gets thought of as like a one-way street. People leave and never come back, but there's actually quite a bit of circular migration that goes on. And actually one of the things that I would advocate for is more sort of like fewer barriers or more incentives for circular migration, right? So people go abroad, get the skills they want to get, come back and reinvest in the places that they're from, right? That happens quite a bit. Another is sort of this example. So the Philippines is a good example of this, right? Where the demand or sort of the opportunity to work abroad in the nursing industry, for instance, right, gave a lot of people lots of incentives to say, I want to become a nurse, right? Because they knew that, you know, they could make a good amount of money doing that abroad. And so an entire sort of nursing industry and high, you know, educational industry around nursing sort of sprung up in the Philippines, in part because of that incentive, in a way that likely wouldn't have happened if the sort of incentive to go, if the possibility of going abroad didn't exist, right? And you can look at other sort of examples of this. There's an article, I think, from like Scandinavia in the 1800s, which was pointing to basically places that sent more migrants had more sort of labor bargaining power, because if you can sort of have the sort of potential to go abroad, you're basically negotiating with your employer on a different set of terms because you can get higher wages by leaving. So, okay, that was a lot. That being said, I think, you know, the things that people are concerned about sort of more specifically are often like, oh, you know, doctors are leaving, health professionals are leaving, and so, you know, we're not going to have people to treat diseases and take care of the population in that way. And I think that's a legitimate concern. I think the research on this is a little less convinced that that's actually what happens, but theoretically you can see why it would. But sort of like, I think the factors that push against that, one is like the things I said before, where you may end up producing more health professionals by the fact that they have the opportunity to go abroad, and many of them will stay, right? Two, I think that a lot of the sort of health issues that face like the poorest places in the world are less about having doctors around and more about access to things like clean water and sort of just like basic nutrition and health things like that. And two, or three rather, the other thing that people say is like, well, the sort of like highly skilled medical professionals within these countries often end up in sort of like the biggest cities, treating the most relatively well-off populations in these countries anyway. And so if you really want to address sort of like rural health, you kind of have to implement policies in order to sort of support that. And it's not clear that particularly like the brain drain is the biggest impediment. Yeah. and I just think, if people have an incentive to stay in the place that they're from, they often do. I mean, the vast majority of people in the world do not migrate for a variety of reasons, right? Or they don't migrate internationally, at least, for a variety of reasons. Now, many more want to than are able to, but there's always barriers, just whether it's you are sort of invested in the sort of family connections or social connections you have in a place, the cultural life you have in a place. So I think migration is, a tool and can be helpful, but again, it's not the only thing. And I don't necessarily mean to dismiss the concerns of the brain drain, but um, it's good to think of these things as more a part of like a complex system rather than a binary, you support migration or you don't of the high school population, for instance.
Well, I guess so. Your main argument would be to regard brain drain as an effect rather than a cause of poverty of a nation, right? So there would have to be other policies that other changes in institutions, quality of government, and things like that, in order to uh, reverse the loss of highly talented individuals, right?
Yeah, I think that's one way to think about it. And policies to sort of incentivize maybe that return migration, right? Get the skills abroad and then incentivize people to be able to come back and invest in the places they're from.
Yeah. So also you raised an earlier point about circulatory migration, and I was thinking about I think it was research done by Doc Massey here at my institute,
Yeah.
and so basically he was talking about the relative ease with which Mexicans used to be able to just cross the border and then come back. And then since the border laws have been stiffened, maybe 30 years or so ago, you saw sort of a stop to the circulatory migration. Actually, people stay here, and the undocumented population, as a share of population, increased. Um, and so, is there like a policy lesson to you about the Mexican American migration history, and is there like an alternative path that you think would have been feasible there?
Yeah, I mean, I think what Doug is arguing is that a strategy of, essentially it was the outcome was sort of like the reverse of what the policymakers intended, right? Border enforcement, definitely had some impact on how difficult it was to cross the border, right? And so, in that sense, may have disincentivized some people from crossing the border. But ultimately, what it did was make it so difficult to cross that once you did cross, you were less likely to return and participate in that circular migration, right? And so, I think he's pointing to, you know, the Bracero program, for instance, which existed before, which allowed for this circular migration. And I think what he would advocate for is more opportunities for people to have these legal pathways to, maybe migrate for temporary labor purposes, seasonal purposes, what have you. I mean, I'm more, as we discussed over our Facebook chat, maybe more on like the open border side, but I mean that allows for the same thing, right? So, you know, if people want to stay, they can stay. But if they feel that, what serves them best is to work for a period of time and then return. And like I said, they can invest in their communities in various ways. That's a potential opportunity too. But the system as it was or as it is, you know, less and less allowed for that, like I said, because it became so difficult to cross that a circular uh sort of pattern became less likely. And so, I mean, the conversation around undocumented immigration goes in all sorts of directions, which I'm happy to discuss with you as well. But if you're just talking about, did border enforcement overall increase or decrease the undocumented population in the United States, since 1986, I think I agree with Doug's argument that it increased the sort of like permanent population. And you can see this also in the statistics of like the average time that an average undocumented immigrant has lived in the US, I think is over a decade now. So this is a much longer term population probably than it used to be, right?
And that also means that, if especially if they have children, right, who many of which might be born in the U.S., there is, um, you could say, a more permanent change in the status of that population. I mean, instead of saying, "Well, I'm going to leave my kids back home in Mexico," I'm actually going to have them brought over here, and which I guess overall is a gain in human capital, to use the economics term here, to the U.S. But it sort of contravenes that original objective of the you could say nativist political forces who said that we're going to stiffen the border protections in order to keep those people out. And in fact, it doesn't work the way they hoped it would, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I didn't mention that exactly, but yeah, I mean, you're making the right point, I think, which is that once someone decides it's in their best interest to settle in the United States, all of a sudden it's not just going to be about them. It's going to be about their family that they're either bringing over or that they're starting in the United States. And so, yeah, I mean, you know, this is a pretty clear part of the story of why we have 11 million undocumented immigrants living in the United States, right? And the solution has often just been, as Doug argues, just more and more border security, which doesn't really seem to, have the effects that people think it will. And instead, I think there's more evidence of this increasing in more recent times, but finding these legal pathways for people to come seems like a much more effective strategy, right?
Yeah, it also reminds me of the situation in the German-speaking countries. I know in
Mm.
Austria and in Germany had they have a large population of Turkish people, and they were brought in as sort of guest workers in the 1960s and early 70s. Um, and uh, then when they sort of started to shut the borders, so right around mid 70s, around the oil crisis, um, that's when those Turkish guest workers decided to stay, right? That's why you have such a large Turkish population in Germany today, also in Austria. Uh, and yeah, so it's like the nativist policies ultimately come to a backlash. So there was another point that Doc made, which is about demographics overall in Mexico. Like he talks about the declining rate of fertility. I think it's like two, a little bit more than two in Mexico. And also, if you look at the numbers of like border crossing by nationality in the U.S. Mexican border, uh, I think the Mexican share is declining, and it's like the
Yeah.
like Central American states like Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, which are increasing. And so, for people who don't do migration research, I mean, what's the story behind this? The Central American, as it was called, caravans in the media, right?
Yeah. Well, I think first I should say, like, that sort of, there has been, right now as we speak, there is like a big surge of Central American, quote unquote, surge of Central Americans, coming to the border. There's something seasonal about that pattern, is one thing that should be made clear. So you see a similar trend in 2019. It's not as high in 2019 as it is now, but that's definitely part of the story. But if you just are talking about overall the ratio of Mexican migration to other types of migration, and you pointed to Central American, but you can also say, more migrants, uh, maybe in the past 5-6 years, the number one sort of groups have been India and China, in migration overall, and that's mostly a function of sort of the decline of Mexican migration more than I would say it is a major increase in the other groups, if you're talking about the proportion, right? And so that is like seems to largely be a function of the Great Recession, right? So you can look pretty clearly at the pattern around 2007, and there's a big decrease in Mexican migration, and there's research kind of showing that labor demand in particular industries was like sort of like a leading indicator of that. And so the reason it hasn't recovered as much, I think, perhaps is maybe more related to the long term trend that you're talking about in fertility. So like sort of like the relative decline in the working age population, as well as probably like improved conditions in Mexico, obviously up until um, the coronavirus pandemic, and the sort of economic impacts of that. But yeah, and like Doug kind of predicted this, right? As you implied, right? So I think I actually saw someone post something online today of a paragraph he had that was basically making something of this prediction, not about the financial crisis, but sort of the role that declining fertility would play. Um, yeah, and so that is actually another. So I didn't mention that, but that is another sort of um, aspect of economic growth, right? That we predict will be a relative, an important factor in the relationship between economic growth and migration, right? So places that are sort of lower income start to develop. Usually what happens is a demographic transition where the sort of um, fertility remains high and infant mortality decreases, and so you have a sort of like a bulge in the young population. I mean, this is true not just now or not just of Mexico, but sort of like a sort of increase in population size was one of the factors driving migration from Europe to the United States in the 1800s, combined with various other factors. But the economic growth and development process sort of is part of that story. And then eventually fertility rates decline for a bunch of reasons, and you don't have that same demographic mismatch between like job availability and like the number of young people in the working age population. So that is also a sort of story of economic development, and this sort of like curvilinear relationship between migration and GDP. So yeah, all of that is to say, like, if you're just looking at the ratio of Mexican to other types of migration, it's mostly changed because of a decline in Mexican migration, right? Now, of course, we know that there are at various times been increases um, in especially young people coming from Central America for reasons that are probably somewhat different than the Mexican migration. It's fleeing violence and sort of the instability that's going on in some of these places. Though of course whenever we talk about causes of migration, we need to be remembering that they are complex, and things like poverty and unemployment do play a role as well, right? So it is a little bit different of a story for sure, but the broader context of poor economic conditions can definitely be invoked as part of the story there as well, I think.
And also, uh, the U.S. Had or has a big influence on what's happening in Latin America. So we could go all the way back to the Monroe Doctrine, right, where the U.S. says that It would have the right to intervene in the hemisphere, which includes Central and South America. Um, and it was in 2009. It was in Honduras where there was a regime change supported by the U.S. And also the history in Guatemala that I, for instance, looked at, where um, there was a very powerful company, U.S. company of, I think, banana producers. Hence the terminology "banana republic," right? Where basically the government of those states serve the interests of U.S. corporations. Um, and then, of course, yeah, there's CIA plots in different times of history. Um, so how important do you think that U.S. interventions play in destabilization in Central America?
Yeah, I mean, just on like a basic level, I think it's pretty clear that it played a role. I'm not any sort of expert on these U.S. interventions or like the histories of like the civil wars and instabilities or CIA plots, as you say. So I shouldn't comment in too much detail. But I mean, I think that I mean, Doug points this out in his work as well. The sort of the irony of the increase in migration from different parts of Latin America, particularly Central America, in the sort of like post 1965 era came after sort of a cap on migration from the Western Hemisphere. So the policy was going in a somewhat different direction, but certainly the instability that comes kind of in the 70s and 80s is definitely playing a role. And insofar as the US and the Cold War and their actions are part of that story, then yes, I think you can definitely trace a lot of those instabilities back to that time. Again, I'm not enough of an expert on the US's sort of role in particular role in Latin America to really go too much further than that. But I don't I think it would be hard to find an academic that really would argue that that's not an important part of it. More generally, I mean, you mentioned um, the Turkish migration to Germany in the post World War II era. So like that process, a similar process to what you described, played out in other parts of Europe as well, right? So the kind of post-war labor demand, rebuilding Marshall Plan was sort of part of a big recruitment process. And the major one of the major differences between Germany and certain other places was that in England, in France, and elsewhere, these were sort of post-colonial labor migrations, right? These were migrations from places where that had been colonized by these European powers. And so, to your point about uh, Central America, the relationship between two countries is always going to be an important factor in not just driving migration, but driving where people end up migrating to, right? So the US's involvement, from a economic standpoint in any country is going to influence who ends up, or if people end up migrating to the US from that place. So US companies doing manufacturing, for instance, on both sides of the Mexican border, right, is going to be influential if people are working for that company, right? um the sort of history of U.S. military bases in the Philippines, right, is obviously a big factor in the historical migrations from that place. So, you know, without getting into too much specifics, as I said, I think just generally speaking, uh, you know, interventions or colonizations or uh, you know acts of war or economic investments are always going to influence these sort of migratory relationships, right? They're going to be an important factor.
Absolutely. So, and I mean, I can think of one more example that was raised by Doc's research, also with Patricia Fernandez Kelly, uh, which is NAFTA, right?
Yeah.
And the effect that agricultural exports from the U.S. to Mexico had on uh, basically the labor demand in Mexico for agricultural producers, which basically declined. And after that, you saw a spike in migration to the U.S. Anyway, so let's turn to domestic policy because I think that's where your expertise lies in. So wrote at least two or three papers now that all relate to this uh, question about why was Donald Trump elected as president in 2016. And sort of big part of his agenda, you could call it nativism, is this idea that we have too many migrants. There's a competition for jobs at home for native citizens versus the foreigners, and it was a way of, you could say, doing divide and conquer within the population, where he would appeal to, you could even domestic marginalized groups like poorer African Americans or poorer Hispanics who are U.S. citizens, um, as a way to sort of yeah rile up his base. So maybe summarize a little bit about what you found in your research and in explaining the politics of migration.
Yeah. So, I mean, sort of the most relevant is really my first chapter of my dissertation is really about this relationship between demographic change, racial and ethnic and migration related demographic change at the local level, and kind of like the influence that has on political outcomes, in this case, voting for Trump, right? And so this is an article that's out at Social Science Research, so you can check it out, called Demographic Change in the 2016 Election. Hopefully, that's a clear enough title for everyone. But basically, what I find is looking at um, county level demographic change since the year 2000 leading up to the 2016 election, and whether places that changed really rapidly in terms of its racial and ethnic composition were more likely to vote for Donald Trump. And specifically, I'm mostly focusing on white voters, though I can also talk about minority voters as well if you're interested. But yeah, and basically what I'm showing, my sort of headline result is that white voters in counties that saw a big increase in the Hispanic population since 2000 were more likely to vote for Trump than you would have expected them to be, based even on who they voted for in 2012, as well as your typical um, gamut of socioeconomic characteristics and things like that, right? So, and the question of whether what impact, if it had any impact necessarily on the actual outcome of the election, I can talk about more, which is of course complicated by the electoral college, which I think all of these analyses are quite complicated by the electoral college. But generally speaking, what I'm kind of arguing is that this candidate who especially was trying to mobilize anti-immigrant sentiment, and of course a lot of that was focused on the Hispanic population, particularly Mexicans, but also Central Americans as well, was able to effectively um, sort of make that message work amongst people who saw those racial demographic changes happening in their local communities, or at least at the county level, is what I looked at, right? So it's kind of this idea of backlash to demographic change, and that sort of is the main underlying interest of my dissertation.
So just as a comparative point here, I mean, I recall some German researcher looking at percent voting support for the AfD, which is their version of right wing party, and it turns out that the sharp increase in voting for AfD happens in the East German states, and um, so just as a bit of context, I mean, a lot of the migrants that come to Germany, they generally settle in West Germany, especially like the two southern states, Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg, because they are the sort of industrial powerhouse of Germany, and they tend to have more jobs and therefore attract more people. Um, while you could say the East Germany, which was a former communist country, um, well, it also has some foreign workers. I mean, historically, I guess the Vietnamese people, which were also part of the communist system. Um, but those are much smaller, right? And so over there, it seems to be that it's the, you could say, the whitest uh, counties or regions that have the highest predicted support for right wing party. Um, and so I don't know. Did you want to say something about that phenomenon? I
Yeah.
mean,
So this at least partially gets to kind of a complicated like methodological point, but I'll try to keep it not as boring as that. But my dissertation is specifically focused on demographic change, right? So how does the population of a county change from point A to point B in my case, which was basically uh, from 2000 up until just before the 2016 election. So there's a distinction between sort of demographic circumstances, like overall, right? Racial demographics overall, and demographic change over a short period of time, right? And so for the latter, the sort of demographic, just the demographic composition, we have a bunch of sort of conflicting predictions, right? Or at least two conflicting predictions. One is this idea of group threat, um, which is the idea that a sort of majority population will be threatened as the sort of like if they live near a bigger minority population, they're going to be more threatened in terms of resources, whether you want those to be framed as material resources, political resources, social resources, right? Um, they'll be threatened, and we'll see some relationship between that group threat and uh, whatever outcome we're interested in, whether it's voting or immigration attitudes or other political attitudes, social attitudes, racial attitudes, whatever it is, right? And then there's the contact effect, right, which sort of predicts the opposite, which is that as people live amongst people that are different from them, stereotypes are mitigated, and you become more tolerant, you become less likely to support these sort of like far right parties, or however it's framed in a particular study. Um, and so those are sort of like the two contrasting predictions that can actually exist in sort of simultaneously. There's a good article by Eric Knowles and Linda Trop that shows how this played out for Trump, which is to say, like, in some parts of the population, maybe the contact effect wins out. Maybe in some parts of the population, the group threat wins out. There's also a book called The Space Between Us by Ryan Enos, where he is arguing that um, segregation is one of the big factors here, which is to say, if you have, two groups that are living in close proximity to each other, but they're very sort of segregated, they're not going to have these opportunities for positive contact, right? And so the group threat might play out particularly in those circumstances. And so we have evidence for both, right? Okay. So that's one sort of like set of complications for the demographic composition issue, right? But there's a bunch of other ones. So Ryan Enos also points to proximity as being important, or sort of what that implies is like, what level of analysis are we looking at, right? So are we saying there's a big group in your neighborhood? Are we saying there's a big group in your city, in your county, in your metropolitan area, big minority group? And how does that sort of, how do the results vary depending on that, right? Is threat, what sort of geographic level is our threat or contact more likely to be generated at? The other one, well, there's a bunch, but another one is selection, right? So, you know, um, particularly, you could say like big cities, right? A lot of people that want to live in New York are going to be particularly moving to a place because they value diversity, or they're at least tolerant of diversity, racial diversity, right? Um, so you have a population that is living amongst, um, you know, large groups of racial and ethnic minorities and immigrants, but they may be less likely to view them in sort of this group threat framework because they specifically chose to live in this place, right? And then maybe that gets at what you're saying about East Germany, is that maybe people in sort of these more homogenous places are choosing, or have chosen, or maybe they're not moving to that place, but they've at least decided not to leave that place that's more homogenous, so they may prefer that. Okay, so I know I've like given you a lot to to deal with there, but sort of the last one I just want to point to is that like there's probably almost definitely variation by minority group, meaning that certain groups are going to be more likely to trigger threat among the majority group than others, and that may be for a variety of social, historical, economic reasons, right? And so the literature ends up being kind of complicated on this in a bunch of ways for that reason. And so a lot of people kind of turn to demographic change as this thing that's like, it's short term, it's sort of disruptive to what people see as their racial and ethnic environment. People are often more impacted by change than they're impacted by sort of like their everyday state of things. And there's less time for them to like select in and out of these places, right? So that's kind of my sort of complicated summary of this issue. But yeah, you could also refer to the article I published that kind of tries to summarize this literature and this debate a little bit.
It seems to be that by measuring change, you are measuring status threat, group
Yeah,
threat,
yeah,
in particular. Because on your earlier point about selection, I think selection is quite important because when you mentioned the example of New York City, where you are based in, I mean, isn't it also the case that urban labor markets are more dynamic, which is to say that uh, you know whether you're native or foreign born, uh, you know you're just going to have an easier shot of finding a job, having good opportunities, and as a result of that, um, you know, it's. I mean, so this whole idea of like nativism, right? I think is born out of the scarcity mindset, right? Which is that, oh, I'm gonna have to, like, if you get something, and you look different than me, it means I'm not getting something, right? And it seems to be that if you can sort of remove the condition of scarcity, from the environment, from the place that people live in, um, it seems to be that this would substantially affect the outlook on things like migration policy. Don't you think?
yeah. I mean, I think it's possible. I mean, this is again another very sort of complicated area of the literature. I'm sure you're somewhat aware that you know the relationship between people's economic circumstances and their attitudes about immigration, for instance, is not there. It's not necessarily. It's often not the strongest predictor, right? And so, it gets to the question of like, well, what's the best way to look at this? Is it actually income? Is it actually unemployment? Or is it some other subjective measure of like economic uncertainty? I think those measures probably do a little bit better. Um, is it the sort of broader economic circumstances in the place, right? And maybe it's not your personal economic circumstances, but it's the place that you live in. You perceive that it's declined in terms of its uh, uh, economic uh, vibrancy, or people are leaving there or whatever it is. Um, and I think that like most people that study this are on the side that like sort of like cultural. So the big literature review on this kind of this article called Public Attitudes Towards Immigration, and their basic like conclusion, they review um, literature on this from like 20 years in like the US, Canada, and Western Europe. And their kind of argument is basically that like um, cultural concerns kind of do the best. Sort of broader economic concerns, right? Not so much about personal concerns, but like the economy is doing bad or immigration is bad for the economy, do do second best, and then kind of like personal economic circumstances do worst. But it's complicated, right? So, you know, I can speak to uh, my research again. So I have an article that I'm it's part of my dissertation that I'm hoping to submit somewhere soon, and I'm looking specifically again at demographic change, right? So, um, what is the relationship between demographic change and immigration attitudes? But particularly, I'm interested in like what subsegments of the white population are more likely to be sort of uh, display backlash in terms of immigration attitudes as a result of demographic change. And so one thing that I find is those without a college degree are more likely to sort of respond negatively to Hispanic growth at the county level, right? And so this is one that I think is pretty fits in well with the literature, because generally speaking, you know, sort of people with lower levels of education and places with lower levels of education are more likely to have negative uh, immigration attitudes. Now, the big debate in the literature is whether that's a cultural or an economic sort of thing, and I can talk more about that. But that's one thing. But the other thing that I find, or let's say this, like, so I don't find that people at lower or higher levels of income are more or less likely to react negatively to demographic uh, change, right? But what I do find is that people who recently had a decrease in the past year had a decrease in their household income are more likely to react negatively to demographic change. So there's a possibility that people are kind of using this demographic change as a scapegoat for the negative turn in their economic circumstances, right? So again, I think it becomes complicated because again, what do you want to look at? Are you looking at income? Are you looking at employment? Are you looking at some you know measure of like a rapid change or deterioration in circumstances? So anyway, that's a long way of getting at your question of like, it's a scarcity mindset. Yeah, I think that's probably right. But I do think that the relationship between uh, economic circumstances and immigration attitudes, for instance, is a complicated one, and I think there's lots of debate in that literature for sure.
Yeah, I would say that, the debate between culture versus economics, in my view, I mean, these things are overdetermined, which means that
Mm,
they're all like it has to work together to some extent, right? So,
yes.
so you have, as you say, a loss of household income, and also, there's group threat by having an increasing share of Hispanic population and things like that. And also, you mentioned this issue of education, where it's also the case that if you look at college level wages, well, they have been stagnant, I think, the last 20 years or so, but it's still at an elevated level, still above median income. While for the high school graduates and less, you actually see a decline of income over time, right? And that strongly suggests to me that, um, yeah, the status threat, and voting for Donald Trump, voting for right wing party, um, would in fact be strongly correlated with yeah, scarcity, essentially. I mean, not having enough, uh, and yeah, so yeah, so but I think the culture and economics ultimately they go together. I mean, it's hard to separate these things. We would probably have to create, restore economic prosperity at large, and then perhaps the picture about immigration becomes more positive. Just as like a historical argument here, I mean, we saw that, you know in the early parts of the 20th century, we saw an increase in the foreign-born population, and then you saw, I think, from the 20s onwards, restrictive migration. It goes down up until the 1970s, um, and then it goes up again, right? And it just in terms of like the time correlation here, right? I mean, you know about this argument about trend glorious, right? Which is
No, what's that?
it's the 30 golden years of economic
Okay.
growth,
Yeah.
between, you could say, the end of World War II, when it was about, when there was a Marshall Plan, there was demand for American produced goods all over the world, um, up until about mid 70s or so. And that also coincided with the period with the lowest share of the foreign-born population. And so I don't know. I mean, if you look at it simplistically, you then might say, well, actually, um, if we were to just close the borders, then we can share more things with native people, like native-born people. Um, yeah, it seemed like a very simplistic analysis. I don't know. Do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, it's a lot there, but I'll try to weigh in a little bit. I mean, I think generally speaking, economists are pretty bullish on the positive impact of immigration on things like economic growth, right? So, I mean, the example of the restrictive policies of the 20s can be serve as sort of like a natural experiment here. And I know I've seen research, and I'm blanking on the author's name, but basically showing that places that would have uh, been more likely to have received more immigration if that hadn't if those restrictions hadn't occurred, saw some negative economic consequences. So basically, the idea was like looking for places where there was a high concentration of different immigrant groups and saying, okay, what happened in these places once the restrictive immigration laws were put into place? And I believe that it's basically found that these places suffered more in the Great Depression, relatively speaking, right? So there's something about cutting off that immigration stream that had a negative impact. And just more generally, like that's sort of the argument that economists make. Of course, you know there's the big debate about, well, the impact on wages, and what is the impact on wages for particular subgroups, right? I think generally speaking, I don't think that there's a pretty strong consensus that immigration doesn't really have this like great negative impact on wages, and if it does, it's maybe particular subgroups, and even then it's probably not particularly large. Um so so that's like a bigger picture. I mean, the other thing that I mentioned before, though, which I do agree with you sort of generally is that the research is, I think, pretty um, convincing on this idea that, anti-immigrant sentiment ticks up right during bad economic times overall, right? So when the economy is bad, that can sort of trigger negative scapegoating attitudes towards immigrants, and you can observe this through sort of like historical analyses, but also more contemporary like quantitative analyses and things like that, right? Now, I think one thing that's argued is that like it's not necessarily the people who are most negatively impacted or the most vulnerable from the recessions who are the ones who demonstrate this uh, uptick in anti-immigrant attitudes. It's sort of like more just like across the population, right? So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind, though, I would say is like, you know, over the course of, and so I have an article in Daedalus with Mike Howard at NYU that came out recently, called Race, Immigration, and Political Polarization, and basically showing that over the past several decades, you know, immigration attitudes have pretty steadily liberalized among the American population, even though we've gone through, some pretty big peaks and troughs in terms of economic uh, circumstances since then, right? So maybe there's upticks during recessions and things like that, but the long sort of pattern has been one towards liberalization. So it's hard to make that like sort of like long-term economic story. Now, who is this among? This is sort of non-Hispanic whites I'm talking about, but like obviously, like the biggest liberalization has been among people who identify as Democrats. A smaller but definitely significant liberalization has been among those who identify as independents, and Republicans really haven't changed their attitudes that much over this time period. So that's why, again, it's a story about political polarization as well. Um, yeah, so I think it's tricky. I don't think it's wrong to say that economic circumstances influence immigration attitudes, but it would be pretty hard to say, like over the last 20 plus years, that that's sort of like the determining factor, because like I said, we've seen a pretty strong liberalization on a number of measures.
So just on the point of wage and migration in certain subsectors, I think like Borges is the Harvard economist
Yeah.
who sort of looks at that, and he's for that matter very bullish, meaning anti-migration, because of the concerns about wage effects. And I mean, my thinking about it is that, so isn't it also the case that, like, if you are like a higher skilled worker, that you would be more protected against, you could say, the foreign competition, right? I read this paper recently about, um, I forgot who the author was, but it was an NBER, and it was about where do high skilled workers cluster, native versus foreign born. And so the foreign born workers tend to be working at private companies around Silicon Valley, they like Yahoo, Google, and those companies. And for that matter, and for that reason, the Silicon Valley companies tend to be very aggressive in lobbying for increasing H-1B visas, um, while the sort of native-born um, high-skilled workers tend to cluster in usually DC area or Boston. So it's usually like defense companies and things like that. Um, like where you need to have security clearance, where you need to be a citizen. Um, that's just one example, and then I mean another example is like in our field in higher education, right? Where if I got a PhD at University of Witwatersrand in South Africa, I don't think I would be entitled uh, that easily to teach at an American university, right? Um, uh, s- so to that extent, and also like other examples would be like in law, right, where you have to pass the bar exam. You went to law school here, things like that. So and even if I practiced law in my home country, I migrate to the U.S. I still have to start off as an Uber driver, for the first few years, perhaps. So that suggests to me that if you are in this broad category of like a lowest skilled native born worker, um, if you have strong resentment against uh, immigrants, and in particular, I guess, lower skilled foreign workers, um, that it's like they're not completely wrong to have that sentiment, right? Um,
Yeah. So one way to think about this, and I'll point you to some more research, but Jens Heimmuller at Stanford has done a bunch of work on this, sort of distinguishing not just the attitudes of low and high skill um, US born Americans, but specifically their attitudes toward lower or higher skill migration, right? And kind of like the basic summary of this story is that, you know, high skill workers are generally more supportive of migration than low skill workers, right? And overall, the population is more supportive of high skill immigration than low skill immigration, right? But the interesting thing is that the high skill worker, so low skill workers support high skill immigration, and high skill workers support high skill immigration, right? So, this idea is like, it's kind of a strange finding in some ways, because people, quote unquote high skill people who in theory would be competing more with these high skill workers, actually prefer high skill migration as well, right? And so, what might the reasons for that be? Well, you kind of pointed to one not a possibility of why they would support high skill migration specifically, but why they would feel less threatened by it, right? You're talking about, they're kind of isolated from the competition because of the types of industries they work in, right? That's sort of what your assessment, your summary of that article was. Yeah. And so I think one interesting thing from this paper, and I think some other places have found something similar too, which is that um, this sort of relationship didn't really vary by how sort of prominent the foreign-born population was within whatever industry this person was in, right? And so there's an article, I think, on Swiss data, which found that sort of um, perhaps more likely explanation for high skill workers supporting high skill immigration are potentially two things. One, which is kind of found, I think, mixed support in the literature, but is one possibility, is that um, these workers fear the tax burden of low skill immigration, and they believe that they're the ones that are going to um, bear that burden. But also, it's this sort of more general idea of like deservingness, right? That, these, it's a classist sort of preference in some respect, right? um and I'm actually sort of doing some research in this area, which I'm happy to talk a little bit more about. But so that's part of the story, right? And then, okay, so then you have, low skill US born workers. They also prefer high skill immigration to low skill immigration, and are less positive about immigration more generally. So, I mean, I think the authors are kind of arguing that, this shows that labor market competition is not especially um important in when you look at these preferences. And then what you could kind of counter that with is, well, but maybe labor market competition is the applies as the reason why for low skill American, US born workers rather than high skill, and it's just more important to them. They're more vulnerable on the labor market, whatever it is. And so I think that's a possibility. But sort of the you know evidence against that, I guess, would just be that, well, if this was the case, then you would probably see more evidence that low incomes are also predictive of more negative immigration attitudes. Another sort of way to think about this, and again, I'll try to remember these articles to send you after we're done speaking, but there's an article by Newman and Malhotra. I think it's called Economic Reasoning with a Racial Hue, which shows basically that the sort of skill preference overall for high skill workers is not race neutral necessarily, right? And so when you frame it as a high skilled European worker versus a high skilled Mexican worker, you see that the skill preference, is not as sort of just race neutral as you might expect it to be, right? And so the question is then kind of becomes, well, is when people think of a low skill immigrant worker in the United States, are they thinking of a generic low skill worker, or do they have a very particular idea in mind of who that is? And I think most likely who they would think of, right? Because that is sort of like the modal quote unquote low skill immigrant worker is a Mexican migrant, right? Because it's the biggest population. And so are they using sort of that as part of their reasoning? So I know, again, that's a lot. I've given you a lot of research and stuff to think about, but like I don't 100% know the answer, but I think these questions are really kind of complicated, and I would be hesitant. I don't think your story is totally implausible, but I would be hesitant to say, yeah, that's definitely the narrative that I would land on, because I think that, yeah, things like race and things like religion, I mean, another point that I could make is like that I'm some research that I'm working on is like, you know, there's a and well, I should say like this may be changing in some ways, but at least you know as of let's say 5 years ago, you could see a pretty clear preference for Asian migration over Latin American migration, right? And there's potentially a bunch of reasons for this, but like one thing people would point to is that um, Asian migration tends to be more high skilled and Latin American migration tends to be more low skilled, right? Now, of course, there's a lot of heterogeneity, but you can say that might be influencing people's perceptions, right? But you see a much lower preference for Middle Eastern migration and a much lower preference for African migration, right? Even though these groups could, potentially would be, sort of considered high skilled relative to the Latin American migration, right? So I guess my point overall is to say, yeah, maybe coming back to your point, which is the like race, class, economics, culture, religion, they all probably play some role. And I think it's complicated. And I think that, that's one of the things that I'm sort of interested in working on, extracting a little more clearly, right?
Yeah, it is quite complicated. I mean, I was thinking of the example of the Gulf countries, right,
Mm,
where they also have this sort of racial hierarchy where I think in Dubai and Abu Dhabi, these places, uh, it, only 15% of the population are citizens, and all the
yeah.
citizens are Emiratis. Um, and so then the rest of the population is foreigners. But then what's very interesting is that they distinguish between expats, which is mostly white people and European American, um, who work in sort of like high skilled jobs. I mean, like a lot of it is like banking or petroleum engineering and so forth, versus the you could say low skilled, mostly South Asian migrants like Pakistan, Bangladesh,
Mhm.
and those are the migrant workers who live in these dormitories and not good living conditions necessarily. um and so, yeah, so it's like a three-part hierarchy, but in society. And I don't know, when I first look at the social model in the Gulf countries, I was a little bit astounded by that, because yeah, because I mean, essentially, if you restrict the citizenship to very few people, well, it has the advantage that you could sort of use the resources to sort of benefit a small group of people, and support them really well. Um, but I would also think that it's potentially unstable, right? Because there's more, you could say, discontent, that sort of builds up because you have such a large group of people. I guess the expats are fine, but you could say the migrant laborers in construction sites, uh, you know, they are sort of kept at, you could say, the bare minimum. Now, I mean, of course, from the Gulf country perspective, they could say, well, they're escaping unemployment in South Asia, right? And we're
Yeah.
at least giving them a job, and they can pay remittances and things like that. And I mean, I totally get that argument, but still, um, it's like a new stratification that's built up, which I don't think can be that good, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm against that sort of system, of course. I mean, I think that there's, people who make these arguments on the lines of like, oh, well, sort of mass migration to these places is acceptable because of like the restriction of social rights, and there's some trade-off between that. And, I shouldn't get too much into that, but I mean, I'm, if anything, of course, arguing for expanded social rights for and political rights for migrants and in the US and elsewhere. And of course you hear, lots of really, sort of troubling things about people having their passports taken away and labor violations and, the lead up um to the World Cup in Qatar, where there's been migrant worker deaths and things like that. So yeah, I definitely wouldn't advocate for for a system like that, I suppose. But yeah, I mean, I do think that those places are interesting from the standpoint of, yeah, they're really the only places in the world where migrants make up a majority of the population, right? And so just from that standpoint, they're very unique places. Um, but yeah, I can't really buy into the argument about, oh, well, migrations will be more acceptable if we restrict social rights. And uh I that's not really something that I see as a political goal of mine, I guess you could say. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so it'd be so let's go back to this political research and thinking about implications and broader policy here, um, which is so we see that there's a, you could say, a lining up of cosmopolitan pro-immigration forces inside of the Democratic Party, which also is partly
Mhm.
explained by education levels, partly explained by being in urban areas, being in, you could say, more well-off communities, um, and then sort of the nativist forces would sort of built up in the Republican Party. And I recall in our chat we were talking about the fact that some areas that were very heavy with Hispanics, particularly South Florida and the southwest of Texas, um, actually were regions that had a swing towards Trump in 2020. And I think part of that might be explained by the fact that, he wasn't, going as aggressively against, like recall at the beginning when he announced his campaign, he said Mexicans are rapists, right? So that was sort of the image that perhaps was stuck in the minds of the Hispanic voters. But this time he didn't focus on that. He's instead his campaign focused on denouncing, you could say chaos of big cities, Black Lives Matter, right? It's about opposing socialism, right?
Right.
And many of these people that had escaped communist places. I mean, we're talking about Cubans in Miami and also Venezuelans. Um, they perhaps heard that, and they said, "Yeah, okay, so voting for Trump means voting against socialism." And so, well, why is it important? Because so if you're like a Democratic Party strategist, you sort of always took for granted the minority vote, right? You're going to have 90% of African Americans voting Democrat, so like 70% of the Hispanics, and then similar percentage for Asian Americans. And from the exit polls in 2020, that that so-called political wisdom doesn't hold anymore. Is it correct?
Yeah, well, I guess I'm not sure that it ever held 100%, right? I mean, I think that obviously a lot of people would make the sort of demography is destiny type argument, but I think that there were um, other people, maybe my advisor Richard Alba included, who was making points about you know the sort of differences in income level, the differences in generational status, as relative to immigration, increasing intermarriage, right, between uh, Hispanics and non-Hispanic whites, and uh, uh, Asians and whites, for instance, as sort of complicating the story of this sweeping obvious path to victory for Democrats, right? And so yes, I agree with you that like maybe generally that demography is destiny argument had been made, but I do think there were people that were potentially warning or at least alerting people to this potential prior to that. And I also think the general underlying thing that could also sort of have been part of that story is like when you look at you know for instance like immigrant voters, um it's not really clear that they are held positions that were firmly in the camp of the Democratic Party on lots of you know economic and social issues, right? So sort of the you know uh voting patterns of a lot of these populations were probably driven by a certain set of issues, and really they're not necessarily as left on a lot of those other issues as that maybe the average white Democratic Party voter or something like that, right? So I think like the undercurrents of that potentiality were always kind of there, and like certain people talked about them. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to get too ahead of ourselves talking about 2020 and what exactly happened, because I think this is always a mistake and was made in 2016, and I'm sure was made prior to that as well, which is to say, one, to sort of just look at the county level election results and kind of draw a sweeping conclusion from that, right? Because counties don't vote, individuals vote, right? And so having individual level survey data, and we do have some of that coming out, but there hasn't been a ton of time to produce a lot of research on this yet, but eventually there will be. But that individual level data, right, is where you really learn specifics about voters, right? Their level of education, their level of income, their age, their immigrant immigration background, or whether they're first generation, second generation, whatever. And those things are, and like their other political attitudes, right? So what do they think about the economy? What do they think about socialism? What do they think about crime? What do they think about immigration? Whatever. We can't get that all from just looking at kind of election results the night after, and even exit polling is not necessarily giving us 100% of that either. So I think slowly but surely we will see more coming out about this. But 2016 election, it really took quite a bit of time. I mean, obviously I'm making some intervention into the 2016 election, but that article didn't come out until 2020, right? Now, I mean, that's longer. A lot of articles, a lot of research came out faster than that. But I do think we should be careful to kind of build a body of research that really gives us kind of more sort of clear answers to these questions. And it might be a little while before we get that, but I think it's definitely the kind of thing where we need to think about why, particularly I think Hispanic voters swung in that direction, and who among Hispanic voters were more likely to do that, and what are their concerns, and how do we understand that going forward is definitely going to be a big question.
Yeah, I mean, so practically, I mean, I would say, I mean, regardless of whether you're Democrat or Republican, I would say the the strategy to try to win an election, um, in my view, it has to be a combination of you know going left on economic policies, which is to say, more infrastructure spending, higher education, social services, things like that. Um, but then also, y- maybe take a more centrist path on, you could say, identitarian issues like, immigration, crime, things like that, cultural policies, and and that seems to be a combination that can produce majorities. Um, people want to have more taxes on the rich. They want to have you know s- safe access to jobs and things like that. Um, and and then on the social issues, there might be, let's not change too much from the status quo. Um, I mean, what's your assessment of what the winning coalition would be?
Yeah, I mean, I think we discussed this a little bit on Facebook, and I don't think that your instincts are necessarily wrong there. And I think lots of people make this kind of argument. I think I sent you like David Shor's article where he's making something kind of similar. I mean, I think just speaking on the issue of immigration, like it is a little bit complicated in some ways because you know depending on how you look at it, you know, a lot of the sort of like big immigration policies that uh, the Democrats or their base wants to do are fairly popular in national polling. But then it becomes a question of, well, is it popular enough in the particular places that we need to win, among the particular populations that we need to win with? And then it becomes um, you know, sort of, do we have the political capital to get it done? Really, is the other sort of thing, because the Democrats it's not like they can just do whatever they want, given their current circumstance in the Senate, for instance, right? So I wouldn't argue about your first point about leftist kind of like immigration or economic policies, or at least what would be considered like progressive economic policies. But yeah, I mean, I guess my in my research, I'm not so interested in figuring out necessarily how Democrats can win elections. I guess I'm just interested in more obviously like just identifying political and social patterns.
But even if Republicans were to adopt that particular strategy, now I know, especially in the economics, it might be a hard sell because, like Trump gave like huge tax breaks to the rich and the corporations. But even if the Republicans were to run on that agenda, I mean, for me, this is really about what is the thing that's going to be popular, what's going to win elections, and what's going to benefit people, basically, right? Yeah, but of course, the most likely party to run on that agenda is the Democratic Party at the moment, so that's for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's pretty clear. Like I said, like it's obviously the Democrats who have moved left on these issues, and that kind of change is important. And yeah, I mean, you know, if I'm speaking from like I said, if I'm speaking from a researcher perspective, I'm kind of interested in social and political patterns more than I am about what's going to be the best strategist's advice or whatever. And then even from a personal political standpoint, like I have a hard time knowing what's gonna win necessarily. So obviously I support progressive change on immigration, and it would be hard for me to make an argument to say, well, I think the Democrats should be careful about that because they don't want to risk, the political consequences or whatever. Because one, I just sort of have this I guess just like ideological bent in that direction. And also I'm just not really sure what is going to be the right or wrong answer there, right? Because any given election, like you said, like Trump really played up immigration in 2016 and then kind of shifted away from it in 2020, and we still don't really know the role that immigration attitudes played. I mean, I think a good example is like people are pointing to now like the situation with at the border as being bad for Biden politically, and it's kind of affecting in a conservative direction polling on certain immigration issues. And that may be the case, but like I said, we've had sort of lots of different circumstances at the border over the past 25 years that you can point to: upticks in migration, changes in the population, changes in the age structure of who's migrating, changes in the motivation of who's migrating, different policies at the border, different types of enforcement, different levels of enforcement, different visa regimes, all of that stuff. And ultimately, the trend has long-term been in a liberalizing direction, right? So yeah, maybe my answer is that I'm not really, the best equipped to tell you in the short term what's going to work, what's going to win, than I am to sort of point out these longer term trends. But I mean, I think one thing that's interesting is the relationship between attitudes and policy with immigration, right? Because I think there's this kind of idea that, at least for a long time, people had this idea that they're out of step in the sense that, a substantial portion of a population wants to see immigration reduced, and that, in the long term doesn't really happen, right? And so you could say like what's the, there's some paradox here, right? But at the same time, like I said, like you've seen great liberalization in attitudes coincide with not necessarily a great liberalization in policy, and in fact kind of culminate in the Trump vote, the Trump election in 2016. So that seems like kind of a paradox too, right? People are becoming more liberal on immigration, but the person that was elected was this anti-immigration candidate. And then, so what can you say? Well, you can talk about the research showing that he may have, mobilized immigration attitudes in this really effective way. It may be the perceived difference between him and Clinton was like much greater than it was between, candidates in the past on this particular issue. So it became more salient. He made immigration very salient himself by how much he talked about it during the campaign, the way he talked about it, right? And so, yeah, you can learn a lesson from that, but what else can we learn from that? Well, he was very unpopular throughout his entire presidency. He lost the popular vote by a fairly big margin in 2016, and then an even bigger margin in 2020. So again, it comes back to, you know, the winning elections question doesn't just necessarily come down to, what's popular or what's unpopular at the national level, but you have to win at these margins within, kind of the political system. And that applies not only, of course, to the electoral college, but, lots of other aspects of our electoral democracy, right?
It's essentially about winning just the right swing states, right? I mean, Pennsylvania,
Yeah,
Michigan,
that's a tough needle to thread, right? I mean, I think you could argue that Clinton learned that in 2016, but you could also argue that Trump and Biden both learned that in 2020, in the sense that, you know, Trump probably tried to thread that needle and didn't really, and came up short. But for Biden, you could also learn a lesson from it, which is to say, well, he was leading by pretty big numbers in some of these states, and it ended up being a lot closer than people thought it was going to be. So, I think, again, threading that needle is kind of tricky, right?
Yeah, I mean, like if you look at, I mean, so I kind of for 2020, I mean, I sort of expected that Biden was going to win because of the, you could say, reconquest of the Obama states, which is like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, uh, and that would have been enough to win it. But I was very surprised about the Arizona and the Georgia results,
Yeah.
um, because it, the last few cycles, I mean, we saw that these tended to be red states, but that shifted around, and I know I saw a demographic analysis of Georgia, where it's like Fulton County, which is I guess the main city, Atlanta. Um, that's where a lot of the population growth is happening, right? And that's what edged out the small margin in favor of Biden. And that and we saw something similar, I think, in Texas as well, right, where the big urban communities like Austin, Houston, and so forth were pushing much more strongly in a democratic direction. And that would be something that the Democratic Party could look out for. I mean, now it's a big question whether it's going to turn the same way as Virginia, right? Because Virginia was under Bush, it was a solid red state, and if you do, I guess, county by county analysis, it is now a pretty solid blue state, isn't it? So um, we saw something similar happening in Colorado as well, right? Um, yeah, yeah. I mean, if I was sort of like a Republican strategist, I would be much more concerned about electoral prospects. But if they if they found a candidate that was really charismatic and could hammer on one issue, whether it's nativism, in the case of Trump, or any other form of mobilization, maybe they have a chance to win again. But anyway, so let me go again to the macro level here. I mean, outside the U.S., because I mean, I sort of become more interested in this issue of climate change, and I saw that actually that um, the relationship to migration is this phenomenon of environmental refugees, right? Where basically, because of an extreme, drought event, the crops are destroyed, and so people are moving usually to a neighboring country or to another place within the same country. Um, and Yeah, do you have some thoughts about that phenomenon of environmental refugees and sort of what we should pay attention to and what we should expect? Because if you look, for instance, at a place like Melilla and Ceuta, which is enclave in Spanish enclave in Morocco, um, you see images of people trying to sort of jump over that fence, and so the Spanish authorities erect more fences. Um, you know, so those images, they sort of should remind us that um, perhaps climate change and migration is going to be the big phenomenon in the 21st century, right?
Yeah, so I would definitely recommend reading um, Heinda Haas's work on this, because he is a little more, I think, measured about the relationship between climate change and at least international migration. Now, you can certainly point to circumstances where this is important, but one of the things I think that he's arguing is that a lot of these environmental disasters are actually often leading to more to internal migration. And I think you kind of pointed that out before, but one of the reasons is that the people who are kind of most vulnerable to these disasters that are related to climate change are going to be sort of the lowest income, most disadvantaged people. And again, as I said before, they often lack the resources to be able to migrate internationally, right? So that's one thing. I mean, I think the other thing that he points to is sort of another, maybe you could say a circular internal migration, I guess you could say, which is that often people migrate out because of these climate related disasters, and will end up coming back and rebuilding the place in a variety of ways, right? So it's not necessarily a permanent migration all the time. I think the other like major thing that he points out is that we have like a kind of like correlation causation question that comes up a lot. And again, a lot of these countries that are, a lot of places that are impacted by climate change are simultaneously being impacted by other sort of broader social and economic changes. And what's actually driving the migration patterns, tying it directly to climate change, can be a little bit trickier. Now, obviously, in the case of a acute event like a natural disaster, you're going to see population movement. But yeah, I'm not an expert in this, but I would definitely recommend Hein de Haas's work, because I think he's a little more cautious to make this big prediction about sort of this global international migration of unprecedented levels or something like that related to climate change, right? Now, that being said, will there be, at different times, different places, international migration linked to climate change? Of course. I think that maybe my sort of philosophical sort of uh, angle on this is like, if we think that like climate change is bad, then of course we should be doing things to address climate change. And I do believe that that climate change is bad, right? And I think that we should be doing, lots of things to address that issue. The problem, I think, sometimes is that it gets framed as a question of like, well, we need to fight climate change because we have to stop people from migrating. And I think that that's sort of wrongheaded for a couple of reasons. One, because I think that frames migration as inherently a bad thing, which I don't necessarily think it is. And two, it's assuming that if we fix, certain aspects of climate change, then we're going to disrupt the flows of migration in this really dramatic way. And I think the reality is that, as we've already discussed on this podcast, there's lots of other sort of changes happening in the world that are going to promote migration at different times in different places. And that's my like sort of approach more generally. I think is that if we want to solve a social issue, let's like, frame it and think of it as that social issue rather than saying, oh, well, this has the added benefit of, stopping migration. And I think I argue against that sort of framing for, kind of the reasons that I've said before.
Yeah, I mean, so my view on that is that we should do something about climate change regardless of what the reason and
Yeah.
motivation is. I mean, like if
Yeah.
it happens to be that nativists make that claim of hugging the tree and sort of like protecting the nature, protecting ourselves. Um, I mean, I'm personally fine with that because basically because of the magnitude of the problem. I mean, I think it's so serious at this point. I mean, like we're already like 1.2 degrees, I think, above the long-term average. We're gonna, all of the political debates are about, how do we keep it under the 2 degrees rise. Um, and so and at this point we have to throw everything that we can at it. I mean, so I saw this interview recently with Bill Gates, and his foundation was funding research on uh, depositing CO2 into construction materials, so usually cement, um, and carbon capture, carbon sequestration, those kinds of technologies. And that to me, like, it might not be enough, but we sort of have to aggressively go into that direction. Um, and yeah, but okay. So with the migration flows, I think if there was, you know, more mitigation measures, I mean, would that reduce environmental refugees? I think it would. But the underlying causes of migration is not just with the environment. I think there are a lot of other factors. I mean, um, like at the beginning of the podcast, you pointed out to development. Essentially, it's about finding uh, uh, a place where you can basically make more money and have an easier life, right? And to that extent, I think you know migration definitely makes sense. Um, yeah, but so I mean, at the sort of the highest level, I mean, at the macro level, I mean, what do you expect out of you could say migration trends? We talked about climate change, but then also demographics we touched on briefly, right? If you have lower fertility rate, it might mean that um, like places like Japan, for instance. I mean, I think they would do extremely well if they took on more foreign-born individuals. Um, but yeah, so do you have a grand prediction about what we can expect out of migration, in the U.S. but also in other parts of the world?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that's a big that's a big question. And again, yeah, I'm kind of I don't know if I'm the best at making predictions, but yeah, I mean, I think as you continue to see the process of, places moving from this sort of lower income status closer to this lower middle income status as countries, you will likely see more demand for migration, right? And so I think sub-Saharan Africa is like one of the biggest examples of this, where you have pretty rapid economic growth in a place like Nigeria, for instance, and probably one of the highest in the world right now. Um, and that's going to portend lots of like social and economic changes. It's going to increase likely the demand for migration. And on the other end, is that demand for migration kind of met by the societies that um people might want to migrate to? I mean, I think that's a harder question. I mean, if I'm just looking at sort of the United States again, like the trends are, people's attitudes and stuff are pointing in the right direction. How and when that translates to, you know, changes in policy, and as we've seen how that increase, how that's affected by sort of like the political uh, whims, meaning, it's not necessarily going to be a straight line, right, from you know increasing more positive attitudes to more liberal attitudes to more liberal policy. But I do think that there's probably some point at which an idea becomes sort of so broadly accepted that it's sort of hard to push back against it with policy, right? um yeah, and then you pointed to like there's lots of places around the world with aging populations who are going to require uh you know increase in their working age population some way or other. And obviously a lot of countries are trying to increase fertility through a variety of ways, but I also think migration is going to be a huge part of that story as well. And so yeah, I mean, is it going to become more of an imperative as sort of you know uh it becomes really much more difficult, both financially and labor wise, to care for these older populations? I mean, the example of Japan is interesting because I do think that there's clear trends in that direction, and realizing that they are going to need to increase their migration going forward. But they kind of like put it off for a long period of time by increasing their working age population through increasing labor force participation for women, right? So a lot of these different like social changes can, in the long term, impact that. And like I said, like a lot of places, I'm sure, a lot of politicians, governments, whatever, would rather increase fertility than increase migration. But it seems unlikely that that first pattern is going to happen on any kind of massive scale that would solve a lot of these problems. So yeah, at the same time, like countries often don't necessarily do what's in their best interest, and that is partially because of their political systems are not producing those outcomes. So you know I'm more sort of confident that there's going to be you know continued demand for migration going forward. And I'm not 100% sure about what that's going to look like in terms of the receiving countries, and how they're going to react to that. Because I think it's an important question, like especially places like that historically, we've seen this play out in Europe, where it's a place that historically didn't have these waves of migration from places outside of Europe until the post World War II era. And that's obviously been a major change to those societies, and is fueling a lot of the populist politics that we see in those places. And a place like Japan is in that category of a place that hasn't really seen mass large scale migration, uh you know in
It's also harder
their
to
connotation
mobilize
here,
on
right?
that politically, right? In Japan, like you cannot easily go out and on a nativist agenda because there just aren't that many foreigners.
Yeah. So I think this is maybe speaks back to my my research a little bit, which I'm arguing is that I don't think sort of these demographic changes necessarily 100% of the time result in this like populist backlash. I think one, you have to kind of think about when they're happening in terms of like what are the broader circumstances surrounding the economy and the social context and everything like that. I think you also need to think about like who is it happening amongst, right? There's going to be some people who like migration and there's going to be some people who don't like migration, and what sort of socioeconomic categories do they fit into. um yeah, but I also think that you know political elites play an important role in terms of how is migration being framed in the national conversation. The media plays a role in how is migration being framed in the national conversation. And there's an interesting article um, that was written also about sort of lead up to the 2016 election. This is the before before the Republican primaries, and they're pointing to I think a similar process that I am, which is basically showing that um, you know Trump's support was not really tied to these demographic changes until he started making these like inflammatory speeches about migration, right? So it's not necessarily just this person's in the conservative party and I'm going to vote for them because I see demographic change happening around me and I don't like it. It may have to be mobilized by sort of the political elites or potentially the media. There's another interesting article by Benjamin Hopkins where he shows basically that increases in the local immigrant population, specifically um, are tied to more negative immigration attitudes during times when migration is more salient in the national media coverage. So he points specifically like right after 9/11, right? Migration was really salient in media related to the 9/11 attacks. And so in places where migration was happening really rapidly during these times, it was the sort of anti-immigration sentiment was amplified as a co-function, I guess you could say, of local migration patterns and media coverage. So yeah, I don't think any of these outcomes are inevitable, right? They all happen within this greater ecosystem of, again, the political, economic, and social context. So that's going to be something to that's going to be really important going forward as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's just like two more case studies that I have in mind here. So the one would be, if you recall, about the Syrian refugee crisis. This should be the last thing I talk about. Um, where so like the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, she said "Wir schaffen das," which means we can do it, right? We can absorb all of these migrants, and of course, that got her a lot of backlash in the elections after that. And then you have the Eastern European countries like Poland and Czech Republic and Hungary in particular. And it's very interesting because those countries were vociferously opposed to taking in any Syrian refugees. They said they were willing to take Christian refugees, which included
Mm,
Syrians, because they said, well, we're a Christian country, we don't want to be overrun by Muslims. So this is old Samuel Huntington thesis about clash of cultures, where
yeah.
they don't belong to us, right? Um, and so and it's quite interesting because if you look at the where's the Muslim population share the highest? Well, you'd have to go to France, Germany, UK, those bigger Western European countries, and it's precisely not in these Eastern European countries. So it's about in those cases, it's about preventing any sort of Muslim migration. Even though if you look at the underlying demographic trends, it does in Eastern Europe, it does remind you of Japan to some extent. I mean,
Yeah.
people aren't willing to have kids, and the native born people. Um, so that's one interesting case study, and another interesting case study I think uh, is Canada, because I don't know any other Western country which is such a universally positive attitude towards immigration. Um, and I was wondering, I mean, like, how much of that has got to do with the fact that its only neighboring country is the U.S., which itself is like the world
Yeah.
powerhouse, and so they get to really select. I mean, the kinds of people that come in. They took 10,000 Syrians or something, and they can sort of pre-screen them and perhaps select them for human capital characteristics. Um, yeah, so I don't know whether you had some thoughts about uh, that model, right? Where it can actually be replicated anywhere.
Yeah. I mean, I think what you're getting at is absolutely part of the story. So there's a article that came out looking kind of at, like, in the US, like looking at like the long term kind of political consequences of high scale and low scale migration. And basically the argument was like that uh, high scale migration uh, has been good for the Democrats and low scale migration has been good for the Republicans, kind of with the idea that people react more positively to high scale migration than they do to low scale migration, and you can see how that would play out in voting, right? So the whole conversation I had before about the preference for high scale and low scale. And so yeah, like I think sort of like the multiculturalism approach in Canada and kind of like, the strong effort to be a welcoming country to immigrants is like all important. But I will say, like, yeah, that it's just a very different situation when, you don't, share a border with a country where there's lots of demand for migration in terms of crossing the border. And yeah, you can kind of create a migrate quote unquote merit based migration system, and people might prefer to have high skill migrants um, overall, right? Now people have made that argument um, before, where it's say, well, we just need this like point system, we need to get rid of family reunification and all that kind of stuff, and then people migration will be more acceptable. I mean, I think that there's I have lots of kind of arguments against that idea. I think when you frame something as I like to call it a classist migration system instead of a merit-based system, and then all of a sudden you can see how the language works to frame these things. But just generally speaking, I think what I'm against is the idea that your opportunity to migrate should be limited by the fact of whether your economic background is higher or lower, right? That doesn't seem to me to be the ideal migration system, even if it kind of plays out in this sort of what people would see as like this positive reception that you get in a place like Canada. So I think it's a tricky thing to do these like cross national comparisons, right? Because the circumstances are pretty different in a lot of these countries, right? The populations that are coming to two different countries, and uh, sort of the history of migration in these places. Um, I mean, I think there's a book Strangers No More by Richard Alba, my advisor, and Nancy Foner, and they do a kind of comparative analysis of the U.S., Canada, Netherlands, Germany, France, and the U.K. And I think it's a good sort of instructive way, and it's mostly about kind of like the outcomes for a lot for like the second generation as well, um, and showing the way in which like these sort of like national models around sort of how the way people treat migration, like the assimilationist model, the Republican model, the multicultural model, whatever it is, you know, they have maybe some influence, but a lot of the kind of like patterns of immigrant integration are going to be driven by, you know, other things. Certainly the, you know, the populations that are coming, but also just the general sort of, you know, economic systems within these countries, right? Where the US has this more, you know, laissez-faire capitalism compared to some European countries. That's going to affect access to the labor market, right? The stronger the welfare state is in, you know, the European countries, for some of the European countries compared to the US, is going to impact sort of the level of poverty that you know, you see among migrant communities and things like that. So again, you know, I think the story of Canada as just like, oh, Canada is like this very welcoming place. And so, you know, the outcomes or the situation with migration there is less controversial or more positive is, you know, part of the story. But I think there's this big, again, bigger ecosystem of factors that go into, you know, making these type of cross national comparisons. And I think that it takes a lot of work and a lot of attention to detail to really suss out what the most important things are.
Okay, I think I'm hitting to the limit of the time. So thank you, Chris, for joining me here in that podcast. And yeah, so we'll end it here. Oh,
Thanks, Larry.
but
I appreciate you. It was a lot of fun.